Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've taken your comprehensive stack of sources, a mix of strategic analysis, naval intelligence, and economic forecasts, detailing the incredibly tense situation in Venezuelan waters right now. It's a dense, but really vital story, and we're ready to cut straight to the core insights. Okay, let's unpack this. What immediately jumps out to me looking at this is that the global approach to Venezuela has just fundamentally changed. I mean, this is no longer a digital sanctions campaign. We're not talking about paperwork and bank freezes.
Not at all.
This has escalated. We're talking about a physical, military-enforced blockade, seizing oil tankers on the high seas.
It's a whole new ballgame.
Yeah.
And the sources are, completely unified on this central conflict. The U.S. is executing a really sophisticated strategy. The analysts are calling it strangulation without destruction.
Strangulation without destruction. Okay, so that second part. Without destruction. If the goal is regime collapse, why are they going to such lengths to protect the assets?
Because the strategy is two-pronged and it's highly surgical. On one hand, the operational goal is to use a really robust naval blockade to intercept the illicit shadow fleet.
Right, the guys turning off their transponder.
Exactly. And that network is trying to move state crude. The sources say the disruption is so complete, there are about 11 million idling barrels just stuck right now? Can't move.
11 million, wow.
But, and this is the key, at the same time, the U.S. is maintaining this meticulously managed sterile corridor just for Chevron.
That feels like a massive contradiction. You're blockading everyone except for one American company.
And that paradox is the core of the strategy. It's what the sources call a precision economic siege. It's designed specifically to starve the Maduro regime of the hard currency it needs to stay in power, while also keeping the physical oil wells, the pipelines, all that export infrastructure functional and preserved. The whole idea is to make the asset impossible for the current owner to use, but perfectly ready for a post-regime transition.
It's just amazing how complex that is.
Yep.
But let's zoom in on the moment this all changed. The moment the U.S. decided to stop using spreadsheets and, start using destroyers, the sources are really clear that the seizure of the tanker skipper was the catalyst.
That's right. The shift from paperwork penalties to physical interdiction really began with the seizure of the skipper. And this wasn't some warning shot. This was an execution of force.
Okay.
The vessel was intercepted way out, carrying approximately 2 million barrels of heavy crude. All of it destined for the global black market.
And what do you even do with a ship that big? What did the Navy and Coast Guard do?
They physically redirected it. They took this massive tanker and sailed it straight to Houston to offload the cargo.
Wow.
And that single action completely changed the risk calculation for every illicit shipper on the planet. I mean, until then, the risk was financial. Fine, maybe your insurance gets voided. Now the new risk is total asset loss. You lose the vessel, you lose the cargo, everything. A 2 million barrel loss to a government that just claimed it.
And the sources say the immediate impact of that was dramatic.
It was instant. It was effective global deterrence. The moment the news broke about the skipper, 6 of these massive carriers that were on their way to Venezuela just made immediate U-turns, abandoned the mission, turned right around, and others just started idling in ports, totally unwilling to sail into what was, overnight, a non-permissive environment.
And we should probably pause on what this shadow fleet really is, because it's not just a few rogue captains. The skipper itself had ties to much bigger black markets.
And exactly. I mean, the shadow fleet is defined by how it operates. They turn off transponders. They constantly change their flag registry. They use these incredibly complex shell companies to hide who owns them.
And it wasn't just Venezuelan crude.
No. The skipper was linked to networks moving Iranian and Russian oil. There were even connections to entities like Hezbollah. So by seizing that hull, the U.S. signaled that the entire global shadow ecosystem faces an existential threat if they operate in the Caribbean. The cost of doing business, as they say.
Skyrocket.
It went through the roof, globally.
Which brings us back to that huge paradox we mentioned. How can the U.S. credibly claim there's a total blockade when Chevron is still moving, 300,000 barrels a day, completely unimpeded?
That is the whole point of the Sterile Corridor. Chevron operates under a very specific, unique license from the U.S. Treasury, so its tankers are explicitly exempt from the blockade. They continue sending crude openly to the U.S. Gulf Coast, while every other sanctioned ship is paralyzed.
And 300,000 barrels a day is not a small number.
No, it's huge. That volume is about 1/3 of Venezuela's total national output. So the U.S. is, in effect, using Chevron to keep the lights on,
Right.
to make sure the infrastructure doesn't degrade, the pipelines don't rust out, and you keep that technical expertise on the ground. It's all about preserving the long-term value of the asset.
Okay, but if they're producing a third of the country's oil, how is this really a financial strangulation? Doesn't some of that cash still find its way to Maduro?
And this is the ingenious part of the revenue trap, the financial firewall. Chevron is strictly prohibited from paying any taxes, any royalties, any cash dividends to the Venezuelan government.
So no direct payments.
Zero. Any money they generate has to be used to pay down old debt or just cover operational costs. It cannot fund the regime.
But what about the oil itself? Doesn't the state oil company, PDVSA, still technically own half of that crude?
It does, but that half is completely worthless to Maduro right now. While half the oil produced technically belongs to PDVSA, the only way for Maduro to monetize it is to export it,
Using his shadow fleet.
using his now blockaded shadow fleet. So he is effectively locked out of his own bank account. He owns the physical crude, but he cannot convert that product into the hard currency, the dollars or euros he needs to run the country.
It's like you said, owning a restaurant, but the government seizes your cash register and blocks the front door.
That's a perfect analogy. The squeeze is absolute.
So let's talk about the legal justification for this. Naval aggression in international waters. That's a big step. The sources keep bringing up the Foreign Terrorist Organization, or FTO, designation. What does that label let the U.S. do that regular sanctions didn't?
It creates the legal architecture. That's the key. It shifts this whole thing from a customs and treasury issue into a military one. By designating the government an FTO, the U.S. can frame seizing ships not just as sanctions enforcement, which can get messy legally,
Sure.
but as a critical counterterrorism operation. And that drastically changes the level of force the Navy can deploy and, the legal standing it has to seize these assets.
And the economic context here just highlights the urgency.
It does. Oil is more than 90% of Venezuela's export income. When you cut that off, you starve the regime of the cash it needs to pay the military, pay civil servants, import food. You cut off the money that maintains loyalty. Maduro's entire power base is built on that cash flow.
We have a really stark quote here from Evan Romero, a former deputy oil minister. He paints an alarming picture of just how vulnerable the regime is.
Romero's analysis is pretty much the final verdict on this strategy.
Right.
He argues that if the U.S. can sustain this blockade, cutting off oil exports, and this is crucial, the narco revenue,
Right.
the regime faces what he calls a final collapse. And the most shocking part of his statement is that his advisors suggest the regime has days left if the seizures continue. Days.
Days left. That just shows you the level of financial desperation inside Caracas.
Complete desperation.
Okay, so beyond that internal pressure, what about the global smugglers? What has this physical interdiction done to the profit margins for the black market?
It's made the Caribbean effectively uninsurable for this kind of trade. I mean, as one analyst pointed out, losing an entire multi-million-dollar ship is a totally different risk category than just paying a paperwork fine. The risk is now total immediate asset loss.
And that risk transfers its cost directly back to Maduro.
Absolutely. The risk is so high, it forces him to sell any crude that does manage to slip through at an even steeper discount. Venezuelan crude was already selling for about $15 less per barrel than legitimate oil.
$15 a barrel is a huge discount already.
A massive discount.
Yeah.
And now, with the threat of your ship being sailed to Houston, buyers are demanding even bigger margins to offset the near certainty of loss.
It almost feels less like a political campaign and more like an aggressive debt collection, especially when you see it linked to this $5 billion demand.
That is precisely what the sources are suggesting. The pressure is explicitly tied to a historical financial ultimatum. The U.S. is demanding $5 billion in restitution.
For what?
For assets seized during the nationalization of the oil industry way back in the 1970s. So this isn't just about current policy. They're using a naval blockade to enforce an ancient multi-billion-dollar debt. That level of institutional memory is, frankly, kind of terrifying.
So what does this all mean when we zoom out and synthesize this whole strangulation without destruction strategy? What's the best analogy to capture this for you, the listener?
The best summary I've seen is that the U.S. is acting like a court-appointed receiver. When a company defaults, a receiver comes in. They don't burn down the factory, they take control. They keep the business running, using Chevron as that stabilizing force, and manage the assets until the old owner is gone.
So Maduro is the owner.
Maduro is the owner, and he's been locked out of the building. He can't get to the cash registers, but the business itself is being meticulously kept alive for future creditors and, a potential new government.
That is a sophisticated and, frankly, ruthless form of economic siege. But any strategy this aggressive has to come with major risks. The analysis points to two big fault lines.
It does. The first risk is purely operational. Can the U.S. successfully preserve the oil infrastructure with Chevron while the political regime collapses from the financial pressure? Those two things have to be perfectly synchronized.
And the second risk?
The second is much bigger. It's geopolitical. The China factor.
Let's talk about that. Why is China such a complication here?
Because China is the main lifeline. A stunning 81% of Venezuelan oil exports go directly to Beijing.
81%.
So this blockade isn't just a regional issue. It is a direct, aggressive challenge to China's long-term energy security interests in the Western Hemisphere.
That percentage is just massive. So does China just accept this? Or do they see this economic receivership as grounds to escalate?
And that is the critical risk. Beijing has invested billions in Venezuela. They cannot afford to see a major energy supplier just disappear. Nor can they tolerate the U.S. Navy dictating their supply chain security. The real question is whether they escalate from just diplomatic protests to maybe using military or proxy means to challenge the blockade.
Which would turn a financial siege into a major international flashpoint. That tension between the financial strangulation and global energy security, that's the core fault line. It is truly remarkable to see a strategy that is so targeted. It's not about destruction, it's about using military force to achieve a precision financial outcome, a modern form of siege warfare.
And that model really encourages you to look beyond Venezuela. This tactic, using physical seizure of ships plus an FTO designation to justify it, to achieve what is basically an economic receivership, is a highly effective, very aggressive new tool. If this model works here in the Caribbean, the crucial question for global strategists becomes, where else might this tactic be deployed?
Risk defined, portfolio protected.